The Self, Soul, and Spirit. Dark Matter of the Humanistic Approach by Mackenzie Skogstad. The humanistic approach is a really wide grasp on our series and understanding of free will and, the responsibilities that come with that. States of consciousness and connectedness, connecting beyond just the existence of and the consciousness of survival, but within ourselves, within our spirit, within our soul, and those like deeply whole places that are truly us. Um, this area is also where we're going to see the most influence coming from the psychoanalytical applications within psychology, but it's very different in the focus and intentionality and how it's used in the humanistic approach. And then we go on to the drive for self-actualization. This is just defined as fulfillment of one's potential and achievement of meaning. This is where we discuss the ongoing desire of becoming and constantly transitioning and growing. This is a very fluid and movement-based approach within psychology. We talk about development in very different ways in other areas where it's these harsh levels of um, capacity, thought, and things like that. This is a very, as it acknowledges levels of need as the most structured part of the humanistic approach. Leaders, theorists, and psychologists, Abraham Maslow, he created the theory of motivation, which would be what we currently call, the hierarchy of needs. We have Carl Jung, which should be Carl Rogers, but he developed the 5 characteristics of a fully functioning person and added to the depth of the desire for self-actualization includes also positive self-perception. And he developed that as well as positive psychology, which is to aid in positive self-perception, to aid in eventual self-actualization. Then we have Royal May. He's the forefather to existential therapy, and a lot of his work surrounded like the very profoundness and fragility of human life and the innate suffering that we have to process within that as a whole. Paul T. Wong is a current leader in existential therapy where he really highlights all of the ways that we need to better reconnect within ourselves and reconnect in ourselves and also just have to presently acknowledge some realities and the anxiety that comes with having freedom. And then we have Roberto Asiaglio. Pardon me. He is the forefather for the concept of psychosynthesis, which is the connection from self and soul or spirit. This is a very deep aspect of transpersonal therapy, which is a process of getting to self-actualization and spirituality itself. But before we can connect with spirit, we have to connect with soul, so it's kind of like an order of that in a lot of ways. So psychosynthesis is the connection between ego and soul in context to psychotherapy. It was pioneered by that fellow whose name I very much struggle to say, and it was as an additional tenet to transpersonal therapy. This particular concept has been philosophized for centuries, and it's pretty widely but covertly supported by psychologists like William James, who is considered to be one of the forefathers of American psychology, and Carl Jung. The abstraction of self is explained as our deepest sense of wholeness beyond our consciousness necessary for survival. And that came from Eric House. One concept of the psychosynthesis is primal wounds. And primal wounds discuss how we end up breaking that connection because we innately have it as beings and it is taken away by society, which further is previously supported or previously asserted by Maslow. So this discusses that aspect of it, of where we get this disconnection from self at some point between self and spirit, or self and soul. And this is the practice of having to get back to that to be able to connect with self, soul, spirit. There's even an author, like I said, Eric House, who wrote about how we have large scale cultural wounds like patriarchy. And it's a self-feeding machine in some way when we don't address primal wounds, because they create behavior that can create social or antisocial responses and outcomes, just like patriarchy has created a deviation between men's soul and men's egos. And then, because of that, they've created this power dynamic and altering of other. So then they can separate themselves further, just as they've separated themselves from themselves with women and nature. Because patriarchy hurts more than just women. It hurts men, it hurts our ecosystems, and obviously hurts women, and it hurts children. So to acknowledge how primal wounds are so very much a part of human behavior and how they can create actual systems of abuse is incredibly relevant to the field of psychology. So one of the less fun parts about the humanistic approach is that the definitions of practices are really, really broad, and they use very gentle language for very hard, big concepts within human nature and the human condition. But existential therapy is not a uniform practice, but instead like a grouping of balancing concepts of self, responsibility of freedom, and inevitable anxiety because of our access to freedom. And it surrounds human suffering. It's we know that we will all die, things like that. Those are the big concepts that they focus on within existential therapy or existentialism. And to create balances instead of fixations, because these things are real, they're true. We cannot argue or, CBT their way out of it. they know that things happen, and life does not live in a vacuum. So this really applies to a general ideal in therapy, that we have to remind a client of how there are just aspects of the world that we have no control over, and they can be fulfilled with suffering. Um, and if we all understand that and we can all process that, it makes being a better person easier. It makes suffering through it easier. So that's a big focus on existential therapy. It's to help people live authentically, emotionally, and mentally present, and understand that their perspective is always supposed to be affronted and adjusted and changed, and to give that same grace to people that they interact with. Um, it's having empathy in yourself currently and expectation in yourself currently of growth and difference, that you can always hold it on to others. It's a really big, it's a shared aspect within existential therapy. Transpersonal therapy is also relatively difficult to define. There is two different papers that actually wrote about them being difficult to define as part of their science, and so they've developed kind of like soft structural overviews and things like that. Um, but and it has to be that broad because spirituality is the big tenet and states of consciousness and phenomenology. You have to have that broad application within definition to best encapture it. Um, this is the connection to spirit. So if we can get to the point where we have connected to self, connected to soul, then it opens the opportunity to connect to spirit, and that is the outside, the ethereal, the mystic, the wonder. Um, And this is not to say that therapists are allowed to be spiritual guides. That is unethical. It is not about us being anything other than supporting the person to explore their spiritual beliefs. We're working on finding meaning within their lives and making it and then applying it. And we're connecting to higher purpose. And we're again going back and connecting to self, because since that is the originating aspect of the humanistic approach, is to connect to self in these examples, you have to keep doing that to be able to stay within a place that you can do transpersonal therapy and you can connect to spirit. Um, because in the highest levels of self-actualization, connecting to self, soul, and spirit is a natural practice, which is very difficult. I don't know how many people would fully qualify for that. When we talk about the tools in transpersonal therapy, it is going to be things like tarot cards, dream work, meditation, and it doesn't all have to be woo-woo, but it has to be supportive. It has to be open and unbothered by whatever we want to do to figure out where you're connected to, and to help them better grasp on fulfilling themselves and finding that full potential and that meaning that they need to be able to do life. The humanistic approach is the perspective that individual wholeness is what affords humans free will and love and contentment. When we talked about the concept of mature happiness, that was created by Paul Wong, we think about like endurable peace and contentment, and understanding that it's not supposed to be a continual line of it as much as it is the cyclic, the ever growing, ever changing, ever transcending aspect um, within it. But we're always searching for wholeness, and we've already have innately built wholeness in our connections with self, spirit, or self, soul, and spirit. um, it also surrounds the approach of continual growth and transcendence while staying connected and authentic, because we don't want to apply this psychology to just being a constantly receptive person who changes with everyone. Lack of identity is not the ability to transcend and to grow. It is innately erosive to identity and ego and connection with self and soul. um, but it is in the application of our connection to self, soul, and spirit and empathy to ourselves that humans can be in service and responsible for and able to love others. It is the development first within ourselves that we can apply it to the outside world and community. So when we talk about growth, it's constantly expected. And it's not a trial, like it's not meant to have a negative connotation. It's meant to be, this is the part that's always going to happen. We're always going to be learning, we're always going to be growing and changing. When we talk about relationships, it starts with the self. The healthiest relationship with self is what creates the healthiest relationship availability to others. And like again, that kind of hits onto the hierarchy of needs, because we talk about we've got to meet this level of nutrition before we meet this level of shelter. Well, you have to meet a level of self-love before you can meet a level of fully loving others. And it grows with that. And then when we talk about communication, it's thoughtful and authentic. We've already discussed the aspects of free will and how it creates responsibility, and that's where the thoughtfulness comes in, with how we talk to people, how we treat people, that we are truthful, that we are doing things in a manner that is respectful to ourselves first, but respectful to ourselves to be respectful to our community. And it's authentic. It is deeply within ourselves. We are not putting on airs. We are not falling to what society has created for us. We are looking within ourselves to determine how we present. And that can change, just like we talked about with growth, but it needs to be tethered within ourselves and within our deepest parts. But that is the humanistic approach, and here are my resources.